James Holloway had worked as a janitor at Lexington Enterprises for nearly 2 decades. Every morning before dawn, he arrived at the towering office building, his mop and bucket in tow, ensuring the place was spotless before the employees even set foot inside. He had witnessed people come and go, rise and fall, but one thing never changed: his presence remained unnoticed. To the executives in their expensive suits, James was just the janitor. A man in his 60s, dressed in faded coveralls, pushing a cleaning cart down the hallways. To most, he was invisible, an afterthought in the grand scheme of corporate life. But James didn't mind. He knew who he was. He took pride in his work and carried himself with dignity. That morning, as he emptied the trash bins in the executive conference room, a group of young interns strutted in, laughing loudly. They barely acknowledged James as they threw their empty coffee cups on the floor. One of them, a cocky young man named Derek, smirked as he kicked a cup toward James's feet. "Oops," Derek said with mock innocence. "Looks like you missed a spot, old man." The others chuckled, whispering among themselves. James sighed but said nothing. He bent down, picked up the cup, and tossed it into his cart. It wasn't the first time someone had disrespected him, and it wouldn't be the last. Just as he turned to leave, another intern, Melissa, spoke up. "I don't get why we even need janitors. It's not like this job takes any skill." James paused for a second but remained silent. He had heard it all before. As he walked away, their laughter echoed in the empty hallway. What they didn't know was that James Holloway was far more than just a janitor, and soon they would learn the hard way. The day carried on as usual at Lexington Enterprises, employees buried in their work, meetings taking place, and the same interns who mocked James earlier, now busy impressing their superiors. But while everyone else saw James as just the janitor, there was one person who knew his true identity: Mr. Richard Lawson, the CEO. Lawson had been with the company for years, but few knew the story of how he got there. Even fewer knew that James had once been a powerful figure in the corporate world himself. In fact, James wasn't just some random janitor. He was one of the founding partners of Lexington Enterprises. Decades ago, James had built this company from the ground up alongside two others. However, after a series of betrayals and a messy power struggle, he had decided to step away, signing an agreement that allowed him to keep his shares, but forbade him from any executive role. Instead of retiring to luxury, James had chosen a different path, one that allowed him to watch over the company from the inside. That's why, instead of sitting in a boardroom, he walked the halls as a janitor. He saw everything: how employees treated one another, how the higher-ups conducted themselves, and most importantly, who truly valued respect and integrity. As James finished mopping the hallway, he saw Lawson approaching. The CEO, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, gave him a nod of acknowledgement. Unlike the others, Lawson always treated James with respect. "Rough morning?" Lawson asked quietly, glancing toward the interns who were now huddled around a supervisor, laughing among themselves. James smirked. "Same as always. Some people don't understand the value of respect until it's too late." Lawson chuckled. "Well, they'll learn soon enough. Just let me know when you're ready." James nodded. He had been patient for years, but his patience was wearing thin. It was almost time to remind everyone who he really was. James had endured mockery before. He had learned to let the whispers and snickers roll off his back like water. But today felt different. The arrogance, the outright disrespect, it reminded him of the very people who had once pushed him out of his own company. As he walked past the break room, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "Did you see that old janitor's face?" One of the interns, Mark, laughed. "I bet he's been here for decades and still doesn't know how to do anything better than mop floors." Another, Sarah, giggled. "Maybe we should give him some real work, like fetching our coffee. I mean, it's not like he has anywhere else to be." James tightened his grip on his mop. He had expected immaturity from young interns, but what happened next made his blood boil. The supervisor, Mr. Donovan, a middle-aged man who had built his career on stepping over others, smirked. "That janitor? He's nothing. If I had my way, I'd replace him with a cleaning robot. No need for dead weight around here." Laughter erupted in the room. James took a deep breath and walked away. He had tolerated this long enough. As he made his way to the maintenance closet, His phone buzzed. A message from Richard Lawson flashed across the screen. "I think it's time." James stared at the message for a long moment. He had wanted to remain in the shadows, observing, learning, but the way these people treated him, without the slightest bit of humanity, had changed his mind. He put his phone away, straightened his uniform, and smiled to himself. They thought he was nothing. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The next morning, James arrived at the office earlier than usual. He moved through the hallways like a ghost, unnoticed by the very people who should have respected him. Today, that would change. He entered the janitor's closet, but instead of grabbing his mop, he took out his phone and made a call. The number he dialed belonged to Richard Lawson, the current CEO of the company. "Richard," James said calmly, "I need you to call an emergency staff meeting this afternoon. I want everyone there, employees, managers, and interns." There was a pause on the other end. Then Richard chuckled. "You're finally ready to reveal yourself?" James smirked. "More than ready." A few hours later, employees received a company-wide email. Mandatory meeting at 3 p.m. in the main conference room. Attendance required. The office buzzed with speculation. Some thought it was about layoffs. Others assumed it was a new policy announcement. No one suspected the truth. At exactly 3 p.m., James stood at the back of the crowded conference room, still wearing his janitor's uniform. He watched as the very same people who had mocked him earlier, Mark, Sarah, and Mr. Donovan, filed in, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The door opened, and Richard Lawson stepped inside, commanding immediate silence. He cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone very important to this company." James took a deep breath, stepped forward, and pulled off his ID badge. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, "meet James Carter, your company's founder and majority shareholder." Gasps filled the room, faces turned pale. The very people who had humiliated him just hours ago now looked like they wanted to disappear. James folded his arms and scanned the crowd. "Now," he said with a smirk, "let's talk about workplace respect." Silence filled the conference room like a heavy fog. Every eye was on James, the man they had dismissed as just a janitor. The weight of their humiliation was evident. Mark's face had lost all color, Sarah's mouth hung open, and Mr. Donovan's usual arrogance had disappeared entirely. James let the silence stretch, giving them time to process the revelation. Then he spoke. "For weeks, I walked these halls and saw the true culture of this company. I saw who treated others with respect and who abused their positions. I experienced firsthand the difference between a title and true leadership." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Mr. Carter," Mark finally stammered, We had no idea." James arched an eyebrow. "And that's exactly the problem, isn't it? You didn't care who I was. You judged me based on my uniform. You laughed at me, mocked me, and treated me as if I were beneath you. But tell me something, Mark. What makes a janitor any less valuable than a manager?" Mark's lips parted, but no words came out. He had no answer. James turned his gaze to Sarah. "Sarah, do you remember telling me to stay in my place? What place is that exactly? Cleaning up after people like you while you look down on me?" Sarah's eyes welled up with shame. I'm so sorry," she whispered. James wasn't done. He turned to Mr. Donovan, the senior manager who had led the charge in humiliating him. "And you, Mr. Donovan, you were the worst of them all. You set the tone for this toxic environment. You made it clear that respect was reserved only for those with high-ranking titles. But let me tell you something." James took a step closer, lowering his voice so the room had to strain to hear. "Respect is not given based on titles. It is earned through character." A hush fell over the room. The lesson was sinking in. Richard Lawson cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Effective immediately," he announced, "this company will undergo a major restructuring, and it starts with accountability." James locked eyes with the people who had wronged him. "Some of you might not like what happens next," he said, "but trust me, it's necessary." The tension in the room thickened. Everyone knew change was coming, and for some, it wouldn't be pretty. The weight of James's words hung heavy in the air. The employees who had laughed at him just days ago were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, dreading what was to come. Richard Lawson, the CEO, took a deep breath and spoke with a firm voice. Effective immediately, there will be a thorough review of our workplace culture. And some of you, his eyes landed on Mark, Sarah, and Mr. Donovan, will have to answer for your actions. James stepped forward, his voice steady. I've worked in this building long enough to see who treats people with kindness and who abuses their power. Today, those lines become clearer than ever. Sarah, the woman who had told James to stay in his place, swallowed hard. Please, James, I mean, Mr. Carter, I was wrong. I was caught up in the office culture. I never meant. James held up a hand. It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did. His tone was calm, but firm. People like you set the tone for how others are treated in this company. You had a choice every day, to treat people with respect or to tear them down, and you chose the latter. Mark, always arrogant, crossed his arms. So what now? You're going to fire us? His voice carried a nervous edge, but he tried to mask it with bravado. James looked at Richard Lawson. The CEO nodded. You'll face a full review, but I'll tell you this, you're not walking away without consequences. Mr. Donovan finally spoke, desperation creeping into his voice. Richard, we've been with this company for years. One mistake shouldn't erase everything we've built. Richard's gaze was cold. A mistake? This wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern, a culture of disrespect that you helped create, and it ends today. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some employees nodded in agreement, while others looked at the floor, ashamed. James exhaled slowly. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. Everyone in this company, no matter their role, deserves respect. And if you can't give that, you don't belong here. Sarah lowered her head, silent. Mark clenched his jaw. Mr. Donovan looked like he wanted to argue, but knew it was pointless. The reckoning had begun. And it was far from over. The air in the conference room grew thick with tension. Employees whispered among themselves, exchanging glances as they absorbed the reality of what was happening. Those who had once sided with Mark, Sarah, and Mr. Donovan were suddenly distancing themselves, realizing that the tide had turned. Richard Lawson turned his attention back to the three offenders. I built this company with a vision of professionalism and integrity, but somewhere along the way, we let power-hungry individuals like you create a toxic environment. He shook his head, disappointment evident in his expression. James was right. This stops now. Mark's bravado was fading, but he still tried to keep up appearances. Let's be real, Richard. You think replacing us will magically fix everything? We've brought in millions for this company. You won't find replacements like us overnight. James smirked. That's where you're wrong, Mark. You're replaceable. Respect, dignity, and leadership. Those are the things that truly build a company, not arrogance and bullying. Richard nodded. James is absolutely right. This company doesn't need people who step on others to succeed. He turned to HR. Effective immediately, Mark and Sarah are suspended pending termination review. Sarah gasped. Wait, please. No. Richard's voice was final. You had chances. You could have changed your behavior at any time, but you didn't. Now you face the consequences. Mark's jaw clenched. He knew there was no getting out of this. With a deep breath, he stood up, grabbing his things. This place will fail without us, he muttered before storming out. Sarah, visibly shaken, turned to James. Please, James, I was just following Mark's lead. I didn't mean to hurt you. James gave her a long, unreadable look. Then, with a calm but firm tone, he said, That excuse doesn't work anymore, Sarah. You made your choices. Now you live with them. Mr. Donovan sat stiffly, sweating. He had avoided immediate consequences, but for how long? The room was silent, save for the murmurs of employees still processing what had just happened. James had once been humiliated in this very building. Now, he was the one setting things right, and he wasn't done yet. As the tension in the conference room began to settle, Richard turned to the remaining employees. I know this is a shock for many of you, he said, his voice steady, but this company needs to be a place where people feel respected. No more bullying, no more toxic leadership. There was a moment of silence before a few employees started nodding in agreement. One of the junior accountants, Lisa, hesitated before raising her hand. Mr. Lawson, what happens now? Richard smiled slightly. Now, we rebuild. James, still standing tall after everything that had transpired, turned to Richard. Sir, I appreciate what you've done today, but there's still one more issue that needs to be addressed. Richard raised an eyebrow. And what's that? James looked toward Mr. Donovan, who was still seated, his hands clenched together nervously. I don't think Mark and Sarah acted alone. There's a pattern here, a culture that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. Mr. Donovan swallowed hard. I don't know what you mean. James stepped forward. You knew what was happening, Mr. Donovan. You allowed it. Maybe you didn't participate directly, but you sure didn't stop it. Whispers rippled through the room as employees exchanged knowing looks. Everyone had suspected Donovan's involvement, but no one had ever dared to challenge him outright. Richard's expression hardened. Is this true, Donovan? The manager squirmed in his seat. I didn't think it was my place to interfere. Richard's face darkened. That's the problem, isn't it? Leaders who stand by and do nothing are just as guilty. He exhaled sharply. Effective immediately, you are suspended while we investigate your role in all of this. Mr. Donovan's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Richard's eyes made it clear that nothing he said would change the outcome. Defeated, he slowly stood up and walked out of the room without another word. The employees sat in stunned silence. For years, they had been forced to endure Mark, Sarah, and Donovan's toxic rule, and now, within a matter of minutes, it was all coming to an end. James turned back to Richard. What now? Richard nodded. Now, we make sure this company is what it was always meant to be. And James, he extended a hand, I think we need people like you to help lead that change. James hesitated for a moment before shaking Richard's hand. For the first time in a long time, the workplace finally felt like it had a future. But James wasn't done yet. There was still more to be done. The office was still buzzing from the dramatic turn of events. Employees whispered among themselves, processing everything that had happened. The once feared Mark and Sarah were gone, and Mr. Donovan had been suspended. But what did this mean for the company's future? James, still standing beside Richard, felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. He had spent years being invisible to these people, just a janitor, ignored and mocked. And now, the new CEO was looking at him as if he was an essential part of the company. Richard broke the silence. James, can we talk in my office? James hesitated, but then nodded. The two walked toward the executive suite, and for the first time, James entered the office of the CEO, not to clean, but to have a conversation that could change his life. Richard gestured toward a chair. Please sit. James sat, still cautious. He had been humiliated so many times before that he wasn't sure if this was another trick. Richard leaned forward. I meant what I said earlier. This company needs change, and I believe you can help. James frowned. Help? I'm just a janitor. Richard shook his head. No, James, you're more than that. You've been here longer than most of the employees in this company. You've seen the way people treat each other, the way power is misused, and today you stood up against it. That's leadership. James scoffed. Leadership? All I did was stand my ground. That's exactly what good leaders do, Richard said firmly. They don't just follow orders, they challenge things when they're wrong. They protect the people who don't have a voice. That's why I want you to take on a new role here. James blinked. A new role? Richard nodded. I want you to be part of the company's leadership team, not as a janitor, but as someone who ensures that respect and integrity remain at the core of our workplace. You'd be in charge of employee relations, making sure no one else goes through what you did. James stared at him in disbelief. Just this morning, he had been cleaning floors and taking out the trash. Now, the CEO was offering him a leadership position? Richard leaned back. Think about it, James. You don't have to answer right now, but I truly believe you're the right person for this. James sat there, his mind racing. Was this real? Could he really take on a role like this? One thing was certain, his life would never be the same again. James sat in silence for a moment, staring at Richard. The weight of the offer pressed on him. He had spent years being overlooked, treated as nothing more than a janitor. And now he was being asked to step into a leadership role? It felt surreal. Richard, I appreciate the offer, but James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've spent my entire life doing this job. I don't know anything about running a company. Richard smiled. That's where you're wrong. You know more than you think. You've seen how people treat each other in this office. You've seen who works hard, who cuts corners, and who abuses their power. You have insight that most executives never will. James sighed, rubbing his hands together. Still, I don't have a degree. I don't have management experience. Richard leaned forward. Neither did I when I started my first company. Experience comes with time, James. What matters is character. And today, you proved you have the kind of character this company desperately needs. James looked down at the desk. He had spent years watching arrogant employees step all over people like him. The thought of actually being in a position to change that was tempting. What would I even do? James asked. You'd be responsible for ensuring fair treatment in the workplace, Richard explained. You'd help oversee employee conduct, report mistreatment, and work closely with HR to fix the toxic culture in this office. James let out a small laugh. I never thought I'd be having this conversation. Richard chuckled. Neither did I, but life surprises us. James leaned back in his chair. A part of him wanted to reject the offer, to stay in his comfort zone. But another part, the part that had stood up to Mark and Sarah, knew that this was a rare opportunity. Can I think about it? He finally asked. Richard nodded. Of course. Take the weekend. But James, know this. People like you don't get recognized often enough. You have a chance to change things. Don't let fear stop you. James stood up and shook Richard's hand. I'll think about it. As he left the office, he felt the eyes of the remaining employees on him. Just yesterday, he had been invisible. Now, everyone was watching. And for the first time in a long time, James wasn't afraid of being seen. As James stepped out of Richard's office, he could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him. The office, usually buzzing with chatter and phone calls, was eerily silent. Employees who had barely acknowledged him before were now staring, whispering amongst themselves. Did you hear? He's been offered a management position. James? The janitor? No way. I don't believe it. There's no way Mr. Caldwell would actually put him in charge of anything. James sighed, pretending not to hear the murmurs as he made his way down the hallway. He wasn't surprised by their disbelief. After all, these were the same people who had laughed at him, ignored him, and treated him like he didn't exist. As he passed the break room, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. This is a joke, right? Mark sneered, standing with Sarah and a few other employees. There's no way a janitor is getting promoted over people who actually work in this office. Sarah crossed her arms, scoffing. If Richard is really considering this, we need to do something. We can't just let some custodian tell us how to do our jobs. James clenched his fists, but forced himself to remain calm. He knew people like Mark and Sarah wouldn't change overnight. If he accepted the position, he would have to deal with people like them every day. Maybe we should just quit, one of their coworkers muttered. Mark smirked. Maybe we should make him quit instead. James didn't react, but he made a mental note. This wasn't over. If he took the job, he wouldn't just be dealing with paperwork. He'd be stepping into a battlefield. He had a decision to make. Would he walk away from this opportunity, or would he stand his ground and prove them all wrong? The next morning, James arrived at work earlier than usual. He had spent the entire night thinking about Richard's offer and the challenges ahead. He knew that stepping into a leadership role wouldn't be easy, especially with people like Mark and Sarah actively working against him. As he made his way to Richard's office, he noticed the office gossip had escalated. Whispers turned into outright complaints. Some employees had even gone directly to Richard, voicing their frustrations. When James entered the boardroom, he was met with cold stares. Several department heads, including Mark and Sarah, were already seated around the long conference table. Richard sat at the head, his expression unreadable. "Take a seat, James," Richard said, motioning to an open chair. James nodded and sat down, feeling the tension in the air. One of the senior managers, a middle-aged woman named Linda, cleared her throat. "Richard, I think we all deserve an explanation. You expect us to believe that a janitor, no offense, James, is qualified to be in management?" Mark smirked. "I mean, come on. What experience does he even have? Cleaning floors doesn't exactly prepare someone to lead an office." A few people chuckled in agreement. James remained silent, letting them talk. Richard finally leaned forward. "James has been working here for over 10 years. In that time, he's observed everything. The inefficiencies, the strengths, the problems we've ignored. And unlike some of you, he actually listens to the employees at every level." Sarah scoffed. That's ridiculous. Just because he listens to people doesn't mean he can run an office. James finally spoke. You're right, Sarah. Listening alone isn't enough, but understanding people, knowing their struggles, and finding real solutions, that's leadership. The room went silent. Richard smirked. Well said, James. Now let's talk about what happens next. The tension in the boardroom remained thick. James knew that just having Richard's backing wasn't enough. He had to prove himself. Richard leaned back in his chair, surveying the room. James has a perspective that many of you lack. That's why I've decided to give him an opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities. Mark folded his arms. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Richard smiled. Simple. James will conduct a full operational review of the office, something we should have done a long time ago. He'll work with each department, identify inefficiencies, and suggest improvements. At the end of 2 weeks, we'll evaluate his recommendations. If they make a significant impact, he stays. If not, we reconsider. Sarah's expression darkened. So you're making us answer to him now? No, James said calmly. I'm not here to boss anyone around, but I do want to fix what's broken. We all work in the same place, but not everyone is treated the same. I want to change that. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, knowing deep down that James had a point. Richard stood. This isn't up for debate. James starts immediately. As the meeting ended, some employees hurried out, avoiding eye contact. Mark and Sarah, however, lingered behind. You think you're smart, don't you? Mark sneered as he stepped closer to James. James remained calm. I don't need to think I'm smart. I just need to do my job. Sarah scoffed. Enjoy it while it lasts. You won't make it past the 2-week mark. James simply smiled. We'll see. As he left the boardroom, James knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge was ahead. James wasted no time. The very next morning, he began his review, speaking with employees at all levels. Many were hesitant at first, afraid to speak up, but once they realized James was genuinely listening, they started opening up. I've been here for 5 years, one of the cleaning staff, Maria, admitted. But every time I apply for a promotion, it goes to someone less experienced, usually someone Mark recommends. James took notes. He already suspected favoritism, but hearing it confirmed made him more determined. In the finance department, another employee named David whispered, "A lot of money is funneled into projects that never happen. Mark approves the budgets, but no one asks where the money really goes." James raised an eyebrow. That was a major red flag. If Mark had been mismanaging funds, it could explain a lot of the office's dysfunction. As he continued his research, he found even more troubling patterns. Sarah had a habit of taking credit for ideas that weren't hers. Several employees admitted they had stopped speaking up in meetings out of fear she would steal their work. James compiled everything: testimonies, documents, emails. He was uncovering years of misconduct, and it was clear that Mark and Sarah had built a system where they benefited while everyone else struggled. By the end of the week, James had gathered enough evidence to present to Richard, but before he could, Sarah cornered him in the hallway. "You're making a big mistake, James," she said, her voice low and threatening. James didn't flinch. "No, Sarah, the mistake was thinking I wouldn't fight back." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not going to like what happens next." James simply smiled. "Neither will you." James walked into Richard's office with a thick folder in his hands. Inside was everything he had uncovered: evidence of Mark's financial misconduct, Sarah's toxic leadership, and testimonies from employees who had suffered under them. Richard glanced up as James entered, looking curious but unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "James," Richard said, "what brings you here?" James placed the folder on his desk. "You need to see this." As Richard flipped through the pages, his expression darkened. He leaned forward, his jaw tightening as he read through the complaints and financial inconsistencies. "This is serious," he muttered. "If even half of this is true, we're looking at a complete breakdown in management." "It's all true," James said firmly, "and if you don't act now, the company's reputation will take the hit." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "I had suspicions, but I didn't think it was this bad. I trusted Mark and Sarah to run things fairly." "Well, they didn't," James replied, "and it's time they face the consequences." Without hesitation, Richard made the call. Within hours, Mark and Sarah were summoned to his office. They walked in with their usual arrogance, but when they saw the look on Richard's face and the file on his desk, their confidence wavered. "Mark, Sarah," Richard began, his voice cold. "You've been abusing your power, manipulating employees, and mishandling company funds. You're both fired, effective immediately." Sarah gasped. "You can't do this." Mark tried to argue, but Richard cut him off. "Oh, I can, and I just did." James watched as security escorted them out. The same employees they had belittled for years now stood tall, watching justice unfold. As they left, James turned to Richard. "What happens now?" "Now," Richard said with a smile, "I need a new operations manager, and I think I already have the perfect candidate." James raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Richard chuckled. "You, of course." James grinned. He had come in as a janitor, overlooked and underestimated. But now he had earned something far greater: respect, power, and the chance to change the workplace for the better. The ones who had humiliated him were gone, and the company was finally in good hands. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others. Have you ever experienced or witnessed workplace injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments. 10. Subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change.